Today, I'll tell you a story so quietly intense it lingers long after it ends. Set in the raw, wind-beaten frontier of the Old West, where storms rise without warning and hearts are tested just as hard as land and timber. This is a place where survival demands strength, but love demands courage few can afford. And it all started with one fleeting moment, something almost meaningless at first glance, that slowly unraveled fear, jealousy, and a truth neither of them wanted to face. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The hill above Red Creek never slept in. Dawn always arrived early there, long before the sun had any warmth to give the frost clinging to the grass. Thorne Ashveil was already awake when that first pale light crept across the land. At 25, he carried himself like a man who'd lived twice that long. Broad through the shoulders, skin weathered by sun and wind, moving with the quiet efficiency life on the frontier demanded. Out here, a man learned to rely on his own backbone, or he didn't last. Thorne's cabin leaned slightly into the slope, built from rough-cut pine and patched so many times it resembled a stitched blanket more than a house. But it stood firm. It always had. It withstood winter gales and summer dust storms alike, and that was all Thorne ever asked of a home. He didn't care for comforts or decoration, only a roof that didn't leak and enough silence to hear his thoughts settle. His mornings followed the same ritual. He struck a match, set water to boil on the iron stove, and poured himself a mug of black coffee strong enough to jolt the dead awake. He drank it on the porch, boots resting on a railing he'd already repaired 3 times that year, watching fog peel away from the valley below. The sight steadied him, the wide sweep of grassland, the slow curve of the creek, cattle drifting in the distance, like dark shadows moving across the earth. When the cup was empty, Thorne reached for his tools. A hammer worn smooth at the hickory grip, a belt heavy with nails, and a coil of fencing wire. They were his truest companions. Whenever shingles tore loose or a nervous mare kicked through a stall wall, the Red Creek wardens knew who to call. Thorne never refused work. Repairing things made sense to him. Wood was honest. Posts didn't lie. Hinges didn't pretend. People, on the other hand, were harder to read. That was why he favored open land. Out there, the wind asked nothing of him. The sky passed no judgment. A man could breathe without feeling the ground pulling at his heels. Thorne rode from ranch to ranch, fixing whatever needed steady hands and patience. One day it was a sagging corral gate. The next, a barn roof peeled back by prairie wind like brittle paper. His horse, a dependable bay gelding named Pyre, knew every trail connecting the scattered homesteads. Man and horse moved as if shaped from the same stubborn grain. By late afternoon, when most cowboys were thinking about whiskey or cards, Thorne headed toward town for his one small indulgence: fresh cornbread from the bakery near the creek. And that meant seeing Ilyra. She was unlike anyone else in Red Creek. There was a quiet dignity in the way she held herself, a strength that didn't announce itself but could be felt all the same. Her Apache heritage showed in the dark braid resting against her shoulder, in the calm depth of her gaze, and in how her voice softened the space whenever she spoke. Thorne never lingered at her counter. He'd nod, offer a brief smile, exchange a few clumsy words about the weather or the last bad wind. He'd never been smooth. His hands were always rough from wire, and his shirt carried the scent of horse sweat and cedar dust. But Ilyra never seemed bothered. She passed him a warm loaf, her fingers brushing his for just a moment longer than necessary, and thanked him as if he'd done her a kindness. That fleeting touch followed him home every time. Still, he kept his distance. A man like him had no business imagining things. Not with a woman like Ilyra. someone who deserved more than a solitary cowboy with a leaning cabin and a toolbox for company. Yet when days stretched long and nights fell too quiet, she crept into his thoughts. Her steady eyes, the way she hummed while arranging baked goods, the faint scent of cornmeal and wild sage clinging to her clothes. He never spoke it aloud, but Ilyra had become the gentlest part of his routine. Something he anticipated without meaning to. Something that made Red Creek feel less hollow. Thorne believed he was content with solitude, until the day everything shifted, until a single look from her unsettled him more than any storm the prairie had ever sent his way. Behind Ilyra's cabin, the creek never fell silent. Even in drought years, when the land split like worn leather, that narrow ribbon of water kept moving, soft, steady, whispering over stone. Ilyra loved that sound. It reminded her of home, of places she no longer belonged, of faces she tried not to remember. Her cabin was small, built from aging cedar logs beneath a cottonwood whose branches swayed like a mother calming a restless child. Each morning, as the sky faded from slate to blue, pale smoke curled from her chimney, welcoming and gentle. Anyone in Red Creek who caught the scent knew she was already at work. Ilyra, 33, born of the Apache plains, had learned baking from her grandmother, not stiff white loaves the settlers favored, but warm cornbread, honey biscuits, pine nut rolls, and fried breads so soft that they tasted like memory itself. Those recipes were what she carried with her after leaving her people behind. They were the last familiar pieces of a life she could no longer return to. Each morning her hands moved in steady rhythm, mixing cornmeal, folding wild honey, grinding pine nuts with the same stone her grandmother once used. She worked without a sound, allowing her thoughts to drift like dust floating through the narrow beam of sunlight, slicing across her cabin floor. Out here, silence was never emptiness. It was armor. Red Creek had treated her gently, far more gently than she had ever expected. The Red Creek wardens did not press her with questions. They bought her bread, praised her careful stitching, and left her to the quiet life she kept by the water's edge. She never explained why she had left her people, nor did she speak of the ache she carried beneath her calm exterior. The town made up its own stories, and Ilyra let them. Mystery was easier than truth. Several times a week, she carried baskets of warm bread to the trading post, the schoolhouse, or to anyone who had offered her help in small, unspoken ways. She never charged the elderly, nor families bent beneath hard seasons. Her kindness was not something she announced. It was stitched into the rhythm of her days. Yet, no matter how many faces she encountered, there was always one she searched for without realizing it. Thorne Ashveil, the tall cowboy with steady eyes and hands hardened by labor, carrying the faint scent of cedar and sun-warmed leather. Nearly a decade younger than her, yet something about him felt older, anchored, as if the land itself had shaped his patience. Most men made her tense without warning, her defenses rising on instinct. Experience had taught her that attention often came with demands. But Thorne was different. He never lingered too long in her bakery, never pushed conversation beyond what she offered. When he spoke, it was quiet, measured, as though he was always leaving her room to step away if she wished. And that gentleness made her want to stay. She noticed things she shouldn't have. The way morning light caught his lashes, how his thumb tapped against the paper wrapping her bread whenever shyness crept in. How he stood just a little farther back than other men, always granting her space. Respect was woven into every movement he made. At first, it unsettled her. Then it soothed her. Still, Ilyra refused to let her thoughts wander too far. She had already learned the cost of trusting the wrong heart. She remembered being told she did not belong. that love required her to become someone else. Someone she had no intention of being. She had walked away from that life raw and stripped, carrying only her recipes and her resolve. So when Thorne smiled at her, open, unhurried, she forced herself not to read meaning into it. She told herself she couldn't afford to. Yet she felt it anyway. Some afternoons, she caught sight of him riding past her cabin on Pyre, tools clinking softly in the saddlebag. She never waved first, but when he lifted his hand in greeting, her heart betrayed her with a small, sudden flutter. It was not love. Not yet. It was something quieter, like dough rising beneath a cloth. Gentle, patient, almost shy. Still, she sensed the risk. Feelings had a way of slipping through even the strongest defenses, and the life she had built in Red Creek depended on remaining steady, remaining alone, remaining safe. Except when it came to Thorne Ashveil, safety began to feel uncomfortably close to loneliness. And for the first time in years, Ilyra wondered if the creek behind her cabin was not the only thing moving toward change. The wind in Red Creek followed no rules. Some days it whispered lazily through the cottonwoods. Other days it tore across the valley with the temper of a wild mustang. The night before had been one of the violent ones. By morning, overturned buckets lay scattered, soil scuffed raw, and fences leaned like weary old men after a hard shift. Ilyra woke to worse. 3 broken rails twisted in the dirt, snapped where the wind had driven a fallen branch straight through them. She lacked the strength to reset the heavy post alone. She knew it. And though she disliked asking for help, her hands paused only briefly before reaching for the small tin bell hanging by her porch. Everyone in Red Creek knew that bell rang for one man, and he came. By late afternoon, Thorne Ashveil was bracing Pyre near the fence, squinting at the damage with the seasoned eye of someone who had mended more rails than he could remember. "That wind didn't go easy on you," he muttered, rolling up his sleeves. Ilyra nodded from the porch, fingers working a lump of dough she had brought outside. "It always hits this corner first." Thorne tested the remaining posts, his grip firm and sure. Lucky it didn't take the whole line. "These rails are worn. I'll reinforce the joints once the new boards are set." She watched him work, quietly, almost too quietly. Thorne was not a man who filled space with words. He let the steady rhythm of his hammer speak instead. The sun dipped low, painting his face in gold as he knelt in the dirt and fitted a board into place. For a while, the only sounds were hammer strikes, dry grass stirring, and dough crumbling softly between Ilyra's fingers. At last, she spoke. "You work faster than most men I've seen." Thorne let out a short breath that passed for a laugh. "Most men don't make a living wrestling fences." He wiped sweat from his brow with his wrist. "Besides, this is nothing. I've seen rails torn apart so bad they looked chewed through." Ilyra smiled, just barely, but enough for him to notice. Her smile was small, quiet, yet it struck him like sunlight breaking frozen ground. He kept talking, unsure why. Perhaps because she listened in that rare, attentive way she had. His head tipped slightly as he spoke, eyes open and kind, though still guarded. "Storm season starting early," Thorne Ashveil said. "Ranchers are already raising hell. I heard Harlan Vetch and Oric Vetch lost half their chicken coop roof last week." Ilyra made a soft sound that almost counted as a laugh. "Their roof never stays put. They fasten it down like they're scared of waking the chickens," Thorne said, grinning despite himself. Her humor surfaced without warning, light as chimes, gone as quick as a falling leaf. Ilyra's hands kept working the dough, rolling it smooth, pressing it flat, starting again. "My oven nearly gave up on me this morning." she admitted. I think the stone plate's cracked. Want me to take a look? Thorne asked before thinking better of it. Her gaze lifted to meet his. Steady, thoughtful. You've already done enough. I don't want to take up your whole day. It's no trouble. He set the last nail, stood, brushed the dust from his jeans. I'm around. Just say the word. She didn't agree. She didn't refuse either. But the way her eyes drifted toward the cabin, then back to the dough in her hands, told him all he needed. They talked a while longer, about families passing through that week, a newborn out at the Harden place, a rumor that Red Creek might finally dig a second well, ordinary things, everyday talk. Yet it carried an ease Thorne rarely found. He stayed longer than intended. The sun slid lower, washing the porch and pyre in amber, and still he lingered by the steps. Ilyra felt it too. The quiet pull neither of them named. It settled between them like the evening breeze, soft, undeniable. For the first time in years, a man's presence didn't tighten her chest or make her heart fold in on itself. Instead, when Thorne tossed off a dry remark about the neighbor's stubborn mule, her mouth curved into a small laugh. The sound surprised her, but Thorne heard it, and something in his chest drew tight in a way he couldn't explain. When he finally gathered his tools and turned for his horse, Ilyra called after him. Thank you, truly. Thorne tipped his hat, voice low. Anytime. As he rode off, the wind shifted, carrying the warm scent of her baking. He felt a quiet jolt of regret that the fence hadn't taken longer, and Ilyra, standing on the porch with flour-dusted hands, realized she didn't mind the thought of someone staying a little longer. Morning broke gently. Red Creek stirring under a pale sky, the smell of wet earth drifting through town after a light drizzle. Ilyra had just packed a basket of honey biscuits when she stepped toward the trading post. Shawl pulled tight against the lingering chill. It was the kind of calm she cherished, until calm found a seam to pull. She didn't expect to see Thorne so early, not with someone beside him. Near the general store, a young woman waved both arms as if she'd been waiting years to spot him. Maven Crowhurst, bright-eyed and talkative, laughter carrying farther than her footsteps. Ilyra had noticed her around town before, but never like this. Never standing so close. Thorne lifted a tool crate from the back of Maven's wagon and set it down as she talked on, words lost to distance. He looked relaxed, smiling in a way Ilyra rarely saw turned outward. Then it happened. Maven slipped an arm around his shoulders and pulled him into an easy, familiar embrace. Before Ilyra could fully register it, Maven pressed a quick kiss to Thorne's cheek. Affectionate, effortless, the mark of a long acquaintance. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't heated. Still, it struck like an arrow. Ilyra stopped mid-step. The basket in her hands suddenly felt too heavy. A sharp ache tightened beneath her ribs, not anger, not quite. Something older, buried. She had learned how quickly affection could shift, how fast a woman could fade, how easily promises could crumble. Standing there on the dusty street, watching Thorne with someone who fit so easily into his world, the old hurt stirred. Maven laughed, brushing hair from her face. Thorne replied, voice low and patient. He didn't pull away. He didn't seem to notice Ilyra at all. That cut deepest. She forced her feet to move, eyes forward, jaw set. She walked on, basket steady at her hip, heart hammering harder than it should. As she passed, Thorne glanced up, just long enough to catch her braid, her shawl, the rigid line of her posture. She didn't look back. She couldn't. If she had, he might have seen everything she was trying to keep hidden. By the time she reached the trading post, her hands were trembling. She set the basket down and stepped away, fighting the urge to leave town altogether, to retreat to the quiet safety of her cabin by the creek. Running never fixed anything. She knew that. Still, she didn't go to Thorne's place that afternoon like she usually did. She didn't bring him cornbread. She didn't ask if he needed help hauling lumber. She didn't even walk the bend in the road toward his cabin. Instead, she stayed away. She stayed home, kneading dough until her arms burned, folding and pressing the soft mass again and again until the steady motion dulled the ache tightening in her chest. The work demanded focus. The rhythm slowed her breathing, anchored her where she stood, and kept the feelings from spilling over. At the same time, Thorne Ashveil felt the change the instant he returned to his cabin. He had grown accustomed to the gentle knock at dusk. Ilyra standing there with a basket or a small jar of something warm, offering a quiet kind of company he had never learned how to ask for. That evening, the porch remained empty. He checked once, then again. When the sun slipped behind the hills, he sat on the steps, unsettled by a restlessness he couldn't name. He replayed the day, turning it over piece by piece until one moment stood out. The glimpse of Ilyra passing him in town, her shoulders stiff, her eyes fixed straight ahead, as though he were no more than another stranger on the road. Confusion tightened in his chest, followed by a disappointment he didn't recognize. He had no idea what he'd done wrong. He only knew the quiet felt different tonight, colder, heavier, edged with something sharp. But Ilyra understood. She knew exactly what had wounded her, even while telling herself it shouldn't matter. It did, somewhere between shared fences and unspoken words. Thorne Ashveil had come to mean more to her than she ever planned. And that small, sudden jealousy, impossible to ignore, was the first proof she could no longer pretend otherwise. The silence crept in slowly, like dust drifting through sunlight. At first, Thorne barely noticed, but by the second day, when no familiar knock came, when no warm loaf appeared wrapped in cloth, when evening fell without a single glimpse of Ilyra's braid along the road, its weight settled in. Something was wrong. He told himself she must be busy, baking, delivering bread, helping Mrs. Cauldron or someone else who needed it. But the explanations rang hollow. Ilyra had become as steady as his morning coffee, as familiar as the creak of porch boards under his boots. When something that constant vanished, a man felt it, and Thorne felt it more deeply than he was prepared for. On the third day, after pacing his cabin more times than he cared to admit, he saddled Pyre and rode toward her place. The air held that sharp, clean bite of early fall, cottonwood leaves rattling like quiet warnings. As he approached her cabin, smoke curled from the chimney, sign she was home, working as always. He took that as hope. Dismounting, he crossed the yard and rapped lightly against the doorframe. "Ilyra, it's me. I thought I'd check that porch beam before winter sets in." Silence answered him, long enough for the creak behind the cabin to make itself heard, long enough for doubt to creep in. Then the door opened only a few inches, her face framed in the narrow gap, calm, almost too calm. "Thorne, today's not a good time." He blinked, caught off guard by the quiet finality in her voice. "It won't take long. That beam's been sagging since the last blow." "I'll manage," she said gently. "I don't want to trouble you." Trouble me? The words nearly escaped him. Since when did she speak as if he were a stranger? Before he could answer, she added, "I should get back to work," and eased the door shut. The latch clicked. Thorne stood there, staring at the grain of the wood. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't slammed the door. Yet the distance cut deeper than anger ever could. He turned away slowly, walking back to Pyre, his steps heavy with a feeling he didn't understand. He wasn't used to needing people. He wasn't used to wanting someone to look at him the way Ilyra once had. He wasn't used to rejection. All the way home, the scent of her baking seemed to follow him. Warm honey, toasted corn, pine nuts just kissed by heat. He'd always loved that smell. Now it hollowed him out. For the first time in years, his cabin felt too large, too empty. The quiet no longer soothed, it scraped. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the space where Ilyra usually sat, where she set her basket, where her soft laugh once lingered. He rubbed his jaw, frustrated without knowing why. He missed her. Her calm voice, measured as if kindness were a choice she made every time she spoke. The way she looked at him, steady, thoughtful, never weighing him down with judgment. The comfort of her presence, warm as a fire and twice as grounding. The truth struck him hard and clean. He had grown used to her visits, to the sound of her steps on his porch. Now that she'd pulled away, his world felt crooked, like a fence missing its center rail. That night, he tried to lose himself in sharpening tools and mending tack. Nothing held. His gaze kept drifting to the road outside, again and again, waiting, against all sense, for her to appear in the fading light. She didn't come, and as the moon climbed higher, the truth settled heavy in his chest, aching, undeniable. Solitude had always been Thorne Ashveil's armor, but without Ilyra's quiet presence, it no longer felt like peace. It felt like punishment. Thorne was not a man made for kitchens. He could throw up a fence faster than anyone in Red Creek, true a warped beam by feel alone, patch a barn roof while rain lashed his back. But baking was a different kind of battle. Still, he tried. That morning, he stood inside his cabin, staring at a crooked loaf of cornbread cooling on the table. Too pale in places, burned dark in others. He'd used the wrong pan, scorched his thumb, and nearly set the towel ablaze. But he'd made it. For her. He didn't know what he'd done wrong, but he couldn't endure another day of her silence. He wrapped the loaf in clean burlap, saddled Pyre, and rode toward the creek, his heart thudding harder than it had any right to. When he reached her cabin, he caught sight of her through the window, moving quietly about her kitchen, braid trailing down her back. She looked composed, but he knew better. He'd learned the small signs, the way her shoulders tightened when she guarded something close. He drew a breath and knocked. The door opened only halfway. Ilyra held it with one hand, the other arm folded across her middle as if bracing herself. "Thorne," she said, polite, distant. "What brings you here?" He swallowed. "I brought you something." Her eyes flicked to the bundle, then back to his face, guarded enough to make his stomach sink. "I baked it," he added quietly. That earned a quick blink, surprise, unguarded. She had likely never imagined him near an oven. But instead of softening, she lifted her chin. "You should give it to the girl you like," she said. "I'm sure she'll be glad for it." The words cracked like thunder. Thorne stared at her, stunned, then let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Ilyra," he said, shaking his head. "That girl isn't Maven." Her breath caught. The change in her eyes was subtle, doubt loosening into confusion, then something gentler, something dangerously close to hope. Her arms eased a fraction. "It's not," she asked, barely above a whisper. He stepped forward just enough for her to read his face. No, Maven's an old friend, more like a sister. I hadn't seen her in years, and she shows up the same way she always has, with a hug and a kiss on the cheek. He paused. That's just Maven, but she's not who I made this for. Ilyra looked down, steadying herself. I saw you. You seemed close. He released a slow breath. We were catching up. That's all. And if it looked like something else, I'm sorry you had to see it. But I thought you knew me well enough to trust I wasn't making promises to anyone. Her voice came soft and raw. I didn't think I had the right to trust anything. The honesty struck him deeper than he expected. Ilyra, he said gently, you've been hurt. I understand that. But don't put me in the same place as those men. For a few heartbeats, neither moved. The quiet stretched, fragile, awkward, and warm all at once. Wind stirred the cottonwoods behind the cabin, carrying the scent of her baking across the yard. Finally, she stepped back and opened the door wider. Would you like to come in? I was just making tea. He nodded, relief rushing through him so fast his knees nearly weakened. I'd like that. Inside, the cabin felt different. Cozier, warmer, though neither mentioned it. She poured tea with steady hands, eyes drifting again and again to the burlap-wrapped loaf on the table. Is it edible? She asked, a hint of humor threading her voice. Thorne chuckled. If not, we can use it as a doorstop. That earned a small laugh, soft, shy, real. The tension didn't vanish completely. A thin wall still stood between them, built of old wounds, crossed signals, and fears neither knew how to name yet. But they were on the same side of the door now, steam rising gently between them. The cornbread rested warm on the table, and something fragile, hopeful, hovered where silence used to live. After that afternoon of awkward honesty and warm tea, something eased between Thorne Ashveil and Ilyra, slowly, like ice loosening under the first breath of spring. They didn't talk about what had happened. They didn't name the feelings quietly taking root. They simply slipped back into each other's days. Yet nothing felt quite the same. The next morning, Thorne returned with tools in hand, acting as though he'd planned to fix her chicken coop door all along. Ilyra didn't question it. She nodded, stepped aside, and let him work. Even with the softness lingering in her eyes longer than before, Thorne Ashveil fixed more than the door. He straightened the porch beam that had sagged for months. He reset the loose window latch she'd endured through 2 winters. He leveled the crooked pantry shelf that sent her bowl sliding every time she reached for it. He even studied her old clay oven, running his thumb along the hairline crack in the stone. We'll mend this too, he murmured, almost to himself. Ilyra watched him work, warmth blooming in her chest. Gratitude braided with something deeper she refused to name. In return, she baked. Not from obligation or politeness, but from a quiet need to give him something shaped by her hands, something that carried her care. She brought over honey loaves still warm and wrapped in cloth, or pine nut rolls that filled his cabin with a sweet, earthy scent that clung to the walls long after she left. Thought you might like these, she'd say. And Thorne, usually so steady, would rake a nervous hand through his hair and answer, I do. I really do. Simple words. Yet each exchange felt heavier with meaning than either dared acknowledge. Some days, while he drove nails or tightened hinges, Ilyra stood nearby shelling pine nuts, humming under her breath. Her voice, soft, even, wrapped around him like a blanket against the autumn air. Thorne found himself slowing on purpose, stretching tasks longer than needed just to remain there. Sometimes their hands brushed, reaching for the same tool, passing a basket, steadying a plank. The touches were brief, accidental, yet neither pulled away as quickly anymore. In that lingering second, shared breath, shared warmth, something traveled straight to the chest. Thorne's heartbeat stumbled every time, and Ilyra's breath caught in a way she hoped he didn't notice. He did. She knew he did. Still, neither spoke of it. In a small town, word travels fast, and Red Creek was no exception. Soon whispers wove through the trading post, through the saloon where hands swapped stories between whiskey shots. The fellow who fixes fences? Yeah, Thorne Ashveil. He's been spending a fair bit of time over by that Apache woman's place. The baker? The one with the pine nut rolls? That's her. They look natural together. About time that boy found someone. Some remarks teased, some approved. A few came with sideways glances. Because not everyone in the West was kind about a cowboy taking interest in an Apache woman. Still, most voices carried warmth, curiosity, even amusement. When Thorne heard the murmurs, he dipped his head and rubbed the back of his neck, a shy smile tugging at his mouth. When Ilyra caught wind of it while offering bread at the trading post, heat rose to her cheeks. She hid her smile behind the basket, pretending not to hear, though her heart fluttered like a startled sparrow. Once, an older woman winked and whispered, "Men like him don't fix that many fences unless something else is keeping them there." Ilyra nearly dropped the basket. Yet neither she nor Thorne corrected the rumors. They didn't encourage them either. They simply let the silence grow, not awkward, but tender. A space full of unsaid words, a space full of possibility. The road ahead remained uncertain, shadowed by Ilyra's past, by the differences between their worlds, by doubts she kept close. But one truth rang clear. These gentle days were becoming precious, too precious. And Thorne, steady as the hill he called home, was quietly becoming someone she didn't want to lose. Storms in Red Creek never asked permission. They rose without warning, wild, heavy, unpredictable, rolling across the prairie like a living beast with a furious voice. That night, the wind arrived earlier than any rancher expected, howling down from the ridge with force enough to bow the cottonwoods. Ilyra had known storms. She'd endured desert winds fierce enough to peel bark from ancient pines. But something about this night unsettled her. An echo of old fear that tightened her chest and sent her pulse racing. The first crash came when a loose corral plank slammed into her cabin wall. The whole structure shuddered. Flour jars rattled. A bowl toppled and shattered. Her breath caught as the window latch failed, frames bursting open to admit a blast of freezing air. The Blackreach wind roared inside, whipping her braid, scattering papers, flinging sparks from the hearth across the floor. Her instinct wasn't to hide. It wasn't to brace the door or pray it would pass. Her instinct was to run. Before she fully realized it, she snatched a wool shawl from its hook, wrapped it tight, and pushed into the gale. Her lantern nearly died twice before she stopped shielding it and let the storm guide her steps. Only one place felt safe. Only one person. Thorne Ashveil. The wind fought her with every stride as she crossed the dark yard, skirts snapping at her legs, the shawl threatening to tear free. Dust stung her eyes as she pressed on. Her breath came in sharp bursts, but she kept moving, driven by something deeper than fear. She reached his cabin gasping, lungs burning with cold air, heart pounding hard enough to shake her ribs. With trembling hands, she knocked. The door opened almost instantly, as if Thorne Ashveil had been waiting on the other side. His eyes widened the moment he saw her. Ilyra, hell, get inside. He pulled her in with urgency, tempered by care, shutting the door against the violent gusts. Compared to the chaos outside, the cabin felt immediately warmer. Ilyra stood shaking, not only from the cold, but from something raw she'd buried years ago. Something nights like this dragged back to the surface. Thorne saw it all. He always did. "You're freezing," he murmured, lighting the oil lamp with quick, practiced hands. "Come here." He guided her toward the hearth, touch steady, careful not to crowd her. He added a log to the fire, coaxing it until flames leapt bright and gold. Then he fetched a thick quilt and draped it around her shoulders, tucking it snug beneath her arms. Only when the shivering eased did he speak again. "What happened? Are you hurt?" She shook her head, voice barely holding. "The wind broke my fence. Then the window. It just burst open." She swallowed. "I didn't want to stay there alone." The confession slipped free before she could stop it. Ilyra rarely admitted fear to anyone. Thorne knelt slightly so their eyes met, his voice softening into something steady and grounding. "You did the right thing coming here." Her breath hitched, quiet, fragile, unmistakable. She stared at him, lamplight catching the worry etched into his face. For a moment, the storm outside felt impossibly far away. He pulled a chair close to the fire and motioned for her to sit. She did, letting the warmth seep into her palms. The wool shawl slipped. Thorne adjusted it gently, fingertips grazing her shoulder. She didn't flinch this time. Outside, the Blackreach wind raged, shutters rattling, roof trembling, demanding attention. Inside, the silence between them shifted, deepened, thick with what neither had said. Thorne sat beside her, close but not touching, his voice low. "You're safe here, Ilyra. As long as I'm breathing, you won't weather a storm alone." Her eyes closed for a heartbeat, the words washing over her with a tenderness she wasn't ready for. When she looked at him again, the fear had faded, replaced by something quieter, braver. He felt it too. The storm roared on, but in that small cabin, two hearts found a calmer rhythm. Steady, soft, undeniable. Wind could tear fences apart, splinter wood, shake foundations. Tonight, it broke something else. The last fragile barrier between them. The storm slowly eased, though echoes still rattled the shutters. Inside Thorne's cabin, the fire burned warm and bright, filling the room with a golden glow that softened everything. Ilyra sat wrapped in the quilt, close enough to feel the heat sink into her bones. Thorne watched her carefully, not intrusively, never that. Just with quiet attention that made her pulse flutter. He sat beside her, elbows on his knees, face half lit by firelight. Outside, the wind cried at the windows. Inside, a different tension took hold, gentle, aching. Finally, Ilyra exhaled, voice low. "Thorne, about the other day." He met her eyes at once. Her fingers tightened at the quilt's edge. "When I saw you with Maven Crowhurst, I thought..." She swallowed. "I thought you already had someone." Thorne blinked, surprised not by the confession, but by the pain woven through it. He leaned forward slightly. "Ilyra." She raised a timid hand, stopping him. "Let me finish." Her breath trembled. Firelight turned the worry in her eyes raw and vulnerable. "Where I come from, it only takes one small reason to turn away from someone like me. One misunderstanding, one flaw, one moment of weakness. I learned not to expect anyone to stay." Something twisted deep in Thorne's chest. Anger for those who hurt her, tenderness for the woman before him, courage rising to meet the moment. Ilyra looked down. So, when I saw you with her, I felt... The word stuck. She forced it free anyway. Jealous. The truth hung there, finally spoken after years of silence. Thorne didn't laugh, he didn't tease, he didn't leave her alone with it. He reached out slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and rested his hand gently over hers. His voice was steady, low, and wholly sincere. Ilyra, I only want you. The room seemed to still. Fire crackling softly, the wind quieting at the door, time pausing between one heartbeat and the next. She drew in a sharp breath, lifting her eyes to his with something close to disbelief. Why? She whispered. Because when you step into a room, Thorne Ashveil said, his thumb brushing gently over her knuckles, everything in me settles. Because you're strong and kind at the same time. Because you see the world in a way that makes me want to be better. And because I've never known anyone who makes this place, my life, feel less empty. Her eyes shone, not with sorrow, but with something lighter, fragile enough to scare her. And Maven Crowhurst? She asked softly. Thorne shook his head with a small smile. Maven's like a sister. Nothing more. Never was. Ilyra released a slow breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for days. Relief washed through her, warm, quiet, loosening the tight knot in her chest. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I was afraid you'd leave. Like before. Like they did. Thorne's fingers closed around hers. Not possessive, not demanding, just steady and sure. You're not being left behind, he said gently. Not by me. Not ever. The words, plain, solid, spoken in the glow of a crackling fire, slipped past the last guard around her heart. Tears threatened, but she blinked them back, leaning closer without meaning to. Thorne shifted instinctively, closing the space just enough for her to feel his warmth. For a long moment, neither moved. Firelight painted their faces gold. The black reach wind faded to a distant murmur. Their hands, still joined, rested between them like a promise. Then, slowly, carefully, he gave her every chance to turn away. Thorne tipped his forehead toward hers. She met him halfway, drawn in like a breath she'd waited her whole life to release. Their lips touched, light, tender, trembling with all the words they'd never dared speak. It wasn't hurried. It wasn't demanding. It was truth, finally spoken in the only language they both trusted. A quiet kiss in a small wooden cabin, fire warming their faces, hope stirring between them. Outside, the hills still groaned with wind. Inside, two hearts finally found rest. Morning after the storm felt like waking into a kinder world. The hills around Red Creek stood washed clean, the air sharp with wet earth and juniper. Ilyra and Thorne stood side by side in the pale gray dawn, surveying the damage. Fence rails scattered like matchsticks, shingles hanging loose, branches strewn everywhere. For the first time, neither faced it alone. Thorne handed her a pair of gloves, eyes warm beneath his hat. Ready to tackle this together? She nodded, a soft smile at her lips. I am. They worked through the morning, lifting rails, setting posts, gathering broken wood for the fire. Now and then their shoulders brushed, and each time their eyes lingered a moment longer than necessary. The awkward distance of the past week melted away, replaced by something steadier, sweeter. By noon, the fence stood straight again, stronger than before. Thorne wiped his brow and glanced at Ilyra with a small smile he'd begun saving just for her. "You know," he said, "you make hard work feel easy." She laughed softly, surprised by the freedom in the sound. "That's only because you do most of the lifting." They returned to the cabin for lunch, bringing the sun's warmth with them. Ilyra set out fresh honey bread. Thorne brewed coffee strong enough to wake a ghost. They ate on the porch steps, watching clouds drift lazily over the valley. She tucked her legs beneath her. He leaned back on his palms. The world felt quieter then. Still, peaceful, almost sacred. Down the road, two ranch wives, Elna Morrow and Sybil Dray, rode past on horseback. One waved. The other called out with a teasing grin, "Well now, if it isn't Red Creek's favorite pair. You two go together like flour and honey." Ilyra's cheeks warmed. Thorne chuckled low and tipped his hat. The women rode on, laughter trailing behind them, spreading whispers that felt more like blessings than gossip. And truth be told, neither of them minded. The days that followed found a new rhythm, built on warmth instead of careful distance. Ilyra brought fresh loaves in the mornings. Thorne fixed a shutter or tightened a hinge without being asked. Evenings were spent in quiet talk on the porch, watching the sky turn from gold to violet. They didn't rush. They didn't name what was forming. They let it grow the way prairie flowers do. Slow, natural, steady, rooted in good soil. One afternoon, watching the Red Creek wardens pass through town, Thorne cleared his throat. "You ever think about opening a place in town? A small shop, maybe. You sell your bread. I take repair work out back." She looked at him, startled, then softened. "You'd want that? Us working together?" He shrugged, color creeping up his neck. "Seems to me we already make a good team. Might as well let the whole town benefit." The idea settled in Ilyra's heart like a seed ready for spring. A future not built on fear or running, but shaped by her own hands beside someone who chose to stay. And so the plan began, not with grand announcements, but with quiet talk over coffee and bread. Just like everything else between them. Days eased into weeks, and one quiet morning, just as dawn slipped over the hills, they found themselves sitting together on Thorne Ashveil's porch. They were wrapped in blankets against the chill. Ilyra rested her head lightly on his shoulder, and Thorne released a breath he hadn't known he was holding. He turned a little toward her, voice low but certain. "You know," he said, "if you hadn't gotten jealous that day, I might never have realized how much I need you." Ilyra laughed softly, a warm, tender sound that mingled with the first light of morning. "Then maybe it was worth the trouble," she whispered, leaning closer. The sun crested over Red Creek, spilling gold across the land, over the cabin, over the two figures on the porch who finally let themselves share a sunrise without fear. And there, in that simple moment, barefoot, wrapped in quilts, hands brushing as naturally as breathing, Ilyra and Thorne stepped into a new life. Not hurried, not forced. Built slow and steady, like a good fence, a warm loaf, and every lasting love the frontier ever knew. The beginning of everything, woven from the smallest, most ordinary miracle of all. Choosing each other. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blaze the trail. Subscribe, share, leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you. Aviso legal. Disclaimer. These stories are crafted purely for entertainment and may contain imaginative additions or dramatic interpretations inspired by old frontier eras. We use AI-based resources, voice, imagery, and drafting, as part of our creative process. But every final detail is carefully reviewed and shaped by human effort to preserve emotional depth and authenticity. We strictly follow YouTube's rules regarding AI-generated content and refrain from deepfakes, altered identities, or misleading representations. All images, sounds, and related materials are lawfully obtained. Please do not reuse, modify, or distribute any portion of this content without written permission. Thank you for valuing creativity, respect, and original work.